Hi, I'm Chris.
And I'm Jeremy.
And I'm Fergal.
And we're from Movie Smash.
Comic book movies are having a golden age right now with the MCU.
Movies based on comics aren't necessarily a new thing, but they're a big thing.
Join us every other Tuesday on Movie Smash.
We explore these movies and find some hidden gems.
Every other week, we revisit some of the best.
And some of the worst movies based on comics or graphic novels.
Was Green Lantern as bad as you remember?
Heck no!
Is Time Cop the most accurate time travel movie ever created?
Absolutely.
Was Mystery Men way ahead of its time?
Should they be revisited? Should they be forgotten?
Join us on Movie Smash and find out. Listen wherever you find your fine podcasts.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Grimdark History Podcast. This is the podcast where we explore the intersection between history and popular fiction. I'm your host, Jeremy Agnew. And if this is your first time tuning in, what we do on this show is we look at some popular fiction that sets itself in our own history, and then we look at the real history of those events that those characters in our popular fiction would have lived through that maybe aren't in the actual book, or maybe are in the book, but somebody took artistic license to tell you an entertaining story. What we're looking at here, we're in the middle of Season 2, and our focus of Season 2 is the popular fiction of Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles. So we're looking at all the vampires within Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles and what the real history of they would have lived through was like. In our first subject, we looked at Louis de Pontelac, there's a few versions of Louis, of course, that have been reinvented through different eras of fiction. We looked at the Louis that existed in the what's known as the Storyville era of New Orleans from the recent AMC TV series Interview with the Vampire. We looked at how New Orleans started, how jazz started, and all that sort of stuff. So if that's fascinating for you, go back and take a look at the series titled Sex, Jazz, and Axe Murders. Right now we're in the middle of our second vampire, Lestat de Liancourt, who was born and grew up in Auvergne, and this is part 2 in our series. If you want to look at the birth region of Lestat and a real-life paranormal supernatural beast that was drinking the blood of people in his region, a real honest-to-God historical event, go back to episode 1 in this series. But this episode, we are going to look at the life of people in France in general as we get into the French Revolution. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the show. I struggle, as I often do, with how do I even start any particular topic. And I especially struggled when I was thinking about how do I tackle something as huge and complex and as well documented as the French Revolution. Hugely impactful for France and a large part of Europe as well, and an important part of history. And it was an important part of my education as well. And as I've been reading through some of the books I've been going through, doing my research on, I'm remembering parts of my own education going through school, talking about Rousseau, Montesquieu, and things like that. And I was wondering in my head, how do I even start talking about this? So I thought, and hopefully it's successful, but I thought we just try to look at a zoomed out view of France. What's the current state in this episode? And so that we can lay the groundwork for all the action that's going to happen in the rest of the series. because certainly France is a tinderbox. The French Revolution doesn't just poof happen. A lot of connected events have to happen in certain succession and in certain places, and that itself is a result of the history of France. And so I thought, without going through, hundreds of years of French history, we would try to look at what is the greater current state of France and just look at those critical pieces of previous history to pull into the current state to help us understand the context of the current state. What's the context that sets off the French Revolution? So we're going to start here this episode. It's going to be a groundwork episode. We just got to lay the ground so that we can understand what makes somebody take part in a revolution against your own government. So this is what we're going to tackle in this episode, and I'm going to start off with just, a broad view of France. We're going to look at the major classes in France, so that would be the peasants, and then the kind of merchant middle class, and then the nobility, and then what are the important things happening within each of these groups that lay the groundwork that enables the French Revolution to happen. So starting itself, we're going to be talking about France in the late 1700s. So from like the 1760s onwards is where we're going to be talking about. And if you were with me last episode, we looked at a hyper-focused snapshot of that life. We were looking at, if you're interested, go back one episode. It's called The Beast of the Gévaudan. And that looked at a particular region called Auvergne within France itself. And that region is going to pop up several more times through this podcast series. So it's excellent that we chose that as our first topic. So we're going to look at the Paris life, the peasant life. We will be talking about Paris, of course. And then we'll just kind of go from there and see where the flow takes us. Paris itself is surrounded by a region of land that we would call the Paris Basin. It's the original capital of France from as far back as when it was called Francia. It has a lot of rolling open country. The Seine and the Loire river systems are navigable and they give ready access to the sea. There's a lot of lush land from farming all around Paris and especially north towards Flanders. Roads and related transportation infrastructure was a marvel and an example to the rest of Europe. Paris supported not only the 650,000 inhabitants of its region, but also Rouen, which is in Normandy, had a large cotton industry that drew heavily from the Parisian workforce to support its own industry. So Paris, the farmlands around Paris are lush. It's a massive compressed population that supports not only the industry and life in and around Paris and the Paris Basin, but also a major cotton industry in Normandy, France, also draws heavily from the Parisian workforce. So, it's a metropolis location. Lots of travelers are going there. It's a highly educated population that can read and write. Everybody speaks standard Parisian French. So Paris, the immediate area surrounding Paris, it's about as modern and advanced and cultured a place as you could get in all of Europe at this specific era. It's a model and example for the rest of Europe for roads, population, education, philosophy. Paris is leading in this type of parts of life. And yet, once you get 150 miles outside Paris, all of that could change significantly. One of the famous writers of this early era is an English traveler named Arthur Young. He's famous for his travel writings. He spent a lot of time in and around France traveling, and he wrote about life in France as he walked around. He had a lot of great things to say about Paris, but when we get outside France, he has some less than lovely things to say. He wrote of Brittany, Maine, and Anjou all have the appearance of deserts. Brittany is at least heavily populated, it is lightly taxed, and from the 760s on, it had a lot of good roads, but people in Brittany spoke a distinct language from Parisian French. They had a distinctive dress. It has major ports key to the French economy and defense. Brest is in Brittany. It held France's major Atlantic naval port. Loiran was the jumping point for merchants trading in India, and Nantes was the capital of the French slave trades. It was the second largest trading partner with the West Indies next to Bordeaux. So Brittany has a large portion of the French economy is housed and centralized there, and yet they have the appearance of deserts. And when we say that, it's, there's population is concentrated in these few regions, and then outside that, it's like desert. Farming economy is almost non-existent, and it's nowhere near what it would be compared to the Paris Basin, and population is basically non-existent. Aside from Breton, which is spoken in Brittany, Basque and Béarnais were spoken in southern France. Languedoc is a distinct dialect as well, and that's from the Auvergne region, where our character for this series, Lestat, is from. Massif Central, which is where we focused the entirety of our last episode on, was a mountainous, rough terrain, not suited to large-scale farming. It relied heavily on its wool economy. What farming was there was subsistence farming, so people farming just barely enough for themselves to survive, not a whole lot of surplus. They relied on seasonal migration of manpower to the lowland regions that needed a lot of extra workforce during certain times of years, but otherwise it's a heavily poverty-stricken region with a lot of peasants. Our English traveler, that is Arthur Young, had a lot of praise for Paris proper. He was disappointed by many of the other regions. Arthur, in general, thought of France's agriculture as backward and unenterprising compared to English standards. And again, we've got Arthur writing about it, who's an English person, and there's certainly probably some English versus French thinking going into what his attitudes are as he's writing, but still he's an authoritative source, so I'm going to be quoting from some of his thoughts from his writings here. According to Arthur, the root of the problem lay in France's inheritance structure, which divided lands amongst heirs each generation. So in England, you could, in the inheritance structure, give all the land to just one heir, usually the eldest son, but, you could write a will and whoever it was. France's inheritance structure tended to divide all property equally amongst the heirs. So instead of having large, vast estates that would eventually get bigger and bigger in agriculture or whatever related economy that might enable economies of scale, which wouldn't do great for the livelihood of the peasants that had to work the land, but it would enable more taking advantage of large scale wealth coming in, which would enable investment in more advanced agricultural tools and technologies. But they weren't doing this. Property was being divided up, and so there's less revenue coming in per family in order to make good leaps and bounds on how to improve agricultural yields and see that realized in money that you could, respectively see a difference in. So we have lands being divided up. Vast estates that exist in England aren't forming. So there are approximately in France 4 million owners / occupiers. And when I say occupiers, we have people who basically leased land under a kind of a peasant-tenant relationship. So peasants owned approximately 1/4 of all land in France, and that was all minor farming lands, which 2/3 of which was leased to peasants on sharecropping contracts for these tiny plots of lands. So this created a situation in which small farm plots were worked by a peasant family, and they often, because the land that they worked was so small, they barely made enough for themselves and then the rent that they would owe to the landowner. So a lot of variance could happen if you had, bad weather. Your crop yield was reduced. Well, the small plot of land that you had would make the yield that came out of that barely enough for you and your family to live, let alone to be able to pay the tax that you would have to pay to the person who actually owned the land. So they had barely enough to survive or to produce extra to pay the owner of the land, who could in turn sell that and make a profit. Diversification of agricultural crops was low. We're at the height of the Columbian exchange that's happening. So potatoes are new. They're grown to a small extent in some areas, but they were still thought of by most peasants as a strange crop that was fit only to feed animals. In the southwest of France, farming was such that peasants lived off maize, and then they grew also wheat for profit, which they sold. So they lived off maize, grow wheat, and sold that for profit. But maize couldn't grow in northern France, and both crops needed a lot more fertilizer than grain, and manure was also in short supply because there wasn't a whole lot of pasture land, and you couldn't really maintain huge herds of animals to get the fertilizer you would get from the manure. What arable land, what pasture land there was often given over to arable farming land instead. There wasn't a whole lot of crop rotation, and soil resting processes wasn't optimized to maintain healthy land. Next, kind of looking at the knot of taxation and travel costs from moving goods around France was also a barrier to one of these things that will add to the increasing prices of bread that's going to come up later on as one of our major triggers. So there was rarely any kind of unified tax and toll services, and regions themselves often set their own taxes and tolls on moving any kind of goods around, either up and down navigable rivers or up and down the major roadways for wagons. So merchants were effectively punished for taking crop surplus in one area and taking it to another. You couldn't make money off that because the tolls you would pay to take the goods from one area of France to another made it such that your prices were so high in another area of France, nobody could afford to buy it. So it didn't make any sense to take your surplus to anywhere else in France where it was needed. So you're punished for kind of moving goods across the country. So that would make any sort of shortage in one area was unable to be adequately addressed by a surplus in another area of France without the price of the product, the grain, for example, bread, being vastly overpriced at the other end due to the natural price increases that happens from a scarcity of a product, but also all the tolls and taxes you would pay moving that from one end of France to another also increased the price of the bread at the other end. And to give you an idea of just how precarious the food situation is, because we're going to be taught, this is one of the major triggers for the French Revolution, the direness of the food situation. So between 1770 and 1789, so that's a 19-year period, only 3 harvests in 19 years, that's effectively 3 harvests in one generation, were noted to be abundant everywhere in France. Universally, each province in one form or another regularly experienced food shortages in this 19-year period. And it wasn't just bread crops like wheat and grain. Wine crops also regularly failed. And when there's a shortage of, you get bad pasture land, then foraging crops for cattle also suffer. If the cattle can't eat, there's no food for them to eat. Cattle owners have to sell off the herds. And in the 1780s, this actually happened. There was so little foraging crop, the cattle owners were forced to slaughter and sell off their herds of stock. And because every cattle farmer was doing it at basically the exact same time, there was almost no profit to be made because the market was glutted with beef. And then because there's no cattle to make fertilizer, this is further aggravating the fertilizer shortage, which further aggravates the farming situation. So I hope, we spent about 20 minutes here talking about the direness, the precariousness of the food situation. I hope it's not too dry because it's such a critical base point to understanding. So I'll just want to revisit here and just make sure we're good with that before we move on and kind of start talking about peasant life in general. Because, of course, there's lots of peasants everywhere you go in Europe, as is today the same then. The lower classes make up the vast majority of the population. And in France in the 1780s, that was especially so. Poverty, of course, was everywhere. All travelers to France often noted the misery of the state of rural housing and the state of their peasants in general. Travelers would notice that peasants lacked for shoes or stockings often. And of course, when there's no money to be made and no food to eat, you naturally need to feed your family, and that will lead to increasingly desperate actions. High crime is always hand in hand with poverty universally across the world, and banditry in the poorer regions of France was a major concern. And inflation over this time was also a major concern. I talked about how we have manure shortages, we have crop shortages, we have exceedingly expensive tolls and taxes for moving products from one area of France to the other, all of this leading to increasing prices. And inflation is such a concern. Jean-Marie Roland, who was an inspector in Picardy in 1777, noted explicitly that workers needed twice as much money for their subsistence, and yet they earned no more than 50 years ago. And 50 years ago, living was half as cheap. I don't know, many of my listeners are probably saw the grocery prices and the prices for basically everything increase, especially over the COVID lockdowns. And that hasn't really changed much since then, at least not in my region. So inflation of just the bare necessities for living, food, power, warmth for your house, gasoline, all these things have gone up. And I don't, in some cases the stuff went up, 100% or more, and I'm not making twice as much money as I did just a few years ago. I don't know about the rest of you. So the peasants in France are experiencing this 1,000 times worse. One Norman priest wrote in 1774, quoting the Norman priest, "Day laborers, workmen, journeymen, and all those whose occupation does not provide for much more than food and clothing are the ones who make beggars. As young men they work, and when by their work they get themselves decent clothing and something to pay their wedding costs, they marry, raise a first child, have much trouble in raising two. And if a third comes along, their work is no longer enough for food and the expense. At such a time, they do not hesitate to take up the beggar's staff and take to the road." End quote. So we have a Norman priest, so somebody who's in Normandy, France in 1774, writing about the state of the economy. The peasants and even kind of the upper class of the peasants, so journeymen, day laborers, some of these people have skills. They make barely enough that they can afford food, clothing, they can afford to get married, and they can afford one child. They will struggle if they have two children. And if a third child comes along, and there's not a whole lot in sexual protection, condoms and stuff like that. There's no birth control. And if a third child comes along, they're not making enough money for food and the expense of raising 3 child in a family. And they're forced to take up the beggar's life. For the male population of France, that often meant being a migrant worker. And for some of the women population in France, they were also migrant workers as well when they weren't stuck at home dealing with, home type industry. If you're interested, in my last episode, we talked about the role of women in the economy in the Auvergne region, where they were often responsible for looking after animal husbandry issues, taking care of flocks of animals, as well as heavily involved in the wool industry. So destitute women invariably were forced into prostitution. Child abandonment became a growing problem towards the latter half of the century. Child abandonment tripled in size over the 1780s. There was an estimated 40,000 abandoned children a year in the 1780s in France. That's an amazingly depressing statistic. 80% of the population of France, this is an estimated 250,000 migrant peasant workers were desperate for work. And speaking of Auvergne, a parish report from a local dignitary in the Auvergne region noted in 1769 that the only industry the inhabitants have is to leave home for 9 months of the year. End quote. And yet, paradoxically, despite the situation of the peasantry, all major cities were growing. Paris, Bordeaux, Nantes, Lyon, Marseille, all expanded by a half or more, some of them doubling or more in size, concentrating urban poor in these centers as well. Desperate for any work, they crowded together in communal ramshackle homes. And all they could do was look around them and see the nobility eating food, laughing, drinking, and having a good time while they were begging or prostituting themselves. One last note on peasantry here before we move on to the middle classes and the nobility is, I've been setting up, I think we've been talking about a half hour on the life of the peasant class and agriculture, farming, and bread and things like that. Bread made up 3/4 of most of the population's diet. So the vast majority of France, bread is the majority of their diet. A typical peasant could be expected to pay between 1/3 to 1/2 of their income just on their food. 50% of your income is spent just on food to live. That's not including rent, a place like a house or anything like that, any sort of clothing that you would need, and any sort of goods, tools, whatever it is you need to actually do your job, things like that. That's the entire rest of your income. So any fluctuation in the price of bread is potentially devastating to 3/4 of France's population. So, not surprisingly, being so precious to the life of 3/4 of the population, any increase in the price of bread could tip thousands and thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people who were barely able to survive as it is. It could send them spiraling into death or crime or other life circumstances. Many magistrates that ran and controlled the local markets all around France could easily expect angry crowds demanding the lowering of the price of bread in any desperate attempt to intimidate the magistrates into price controls in order to keep them just at that edge of being able to live. And the magistrates across the land generally readily agreed to this, keeping prices of bread and grain under their jurisdiction under weekly review. So they would fix the price of bread. Never mind trying to advocate or anything, the raising of the income, the money that was being paid to peasants to live, or anything like that, never seemed to really cross anyone's mind in any major way. It was always trying to hold the price of bread to something that was affordable, rather than trying to raise their income to match what the economy demanded of it. So let's move on to the middle class. And there's two levels of this middle class, what we call the bourgeoisie or bourgeois. The middle class obviously had a better life than the majority of France's population, but they still had struggles of their own. Much of France's skilled labor was controlled by guilds. Each region had its own guilds, so you could be a member of a stonemason's guild in Auvergne, and then you move to Normandy, and you're not able to find work because you're not a member of the guild there. So being a migrant worker, which a vast majority of France's population was, meant that any time if you had a skilled labor, profession, and you wanted to go do carpentry in one area, stonemasonry, and whatever that is, then you needed the blessing of the local guild before you could get a job. And if you did get a job, they controlled what you could charge, so what your income was, and that often came in the exchange of payment of some kind. So being a destitute migrant worker would mean you rarely had the money to pay whatever tax or whatever it was the guild of that region would demand of you. So it would prevent skilled laborers from taking their trades to other areas and making a good living off of it. Control over the local guilds was often hereditary. The original formation of these guilds was built on the idea of apprentice, journeyman, master skill levels. So if you wanted to hire a carpenter, you went to the carpenter's guild, and I've got a high skilled job here, and then I just need someone to hammer together a frame here. So you need X apprentice level carpenters, and you need one master level carpenter, and here's the rate you're gonna they work all that stuff out through the guild. However, there's a lot of money to be made in being in the guild, especially if you were in the higher levels of the guild. Being a master level in any guild gave you not only the ability to demand higher money, but you controlled who could elevate themselves within the guild as well. So there was a lot of economic value to being in the guild leadership, and the position itself came with the ability to name the next generation of masters that would follow them. And so that often meant that if you wanted your son to take on the family job of being a master level stonemason, they had to be in the guild, and then they had to have a master designation, and then they would have control over the guild themselves. So you would have people who were potentially competent level in a particular trade, raising up potentially incompetent children to master levels within guilds, and they would then have control over that. So you'd have basically a dilution of skill level and kind of a mob-like control over the stonemason work or the carpentry work. For example, you could demand your own positions. You could prevent skilled labor from coming into your region and taking jobs away from you. So it was whoever was more connected politically was able to advance and keep control over lucrative guild work. So somebody who had a family business, who was a master in a local guild, could basically lock down their wealth for generations, able to get cuts of jobs, control who could or could not work and what money could be made, prevented skilled but unconnected workers from getting good work and making money, concentrating wealth in certain parts of the bourgeois class. So, speaking of the bourgeois class, that's the better off crust of this middle class of professionals, the bourgeois or bourgeoisie, depending on where you are. It's an expanding portion of France's population, nowhere near what the peasants are, of course, but a growing population. Between the reigns of Louis XIV and Louis XVI, the population of France grew by about a quarter, so the total population. However, the proportion of the population making up the bourgeois class, bourgeoisie, I'm going to say bourgeoisie, that's the way I like to pronounce it. The proportion of the population making up the bourgeoisie class doubled in that same time frame. So the bourgeoisie class is growing at an increasing rate than the overall population. So there's a very quickly growing middle class. And they also hold a disproportionate amount of the nation's wealth. And this leads to a very fascinating part of French life that I had no idea about until I started reading about this whole era, and that the elevation of nobility and how the bourgeoisie class and the nobility class are blurring together in some way here. And I want to drive a distinction here because we've got a lower bourgeoisie class and an upper crust of bourgeoisie class. And bourgeoisie is the professional class, the middle class, lawyers, notaries, things like that. That's part of the bourgeoisie class. And some of these people have the right connections, the right luck, the right job to be in the right place at the right time, and their family makes a lot of money. And other ones can be very skilled and have a good job but not do much more with their lives, which is fine. I want to talk about the wealthy crust of the bourgeoisie class, though. The class that's really growing, making a lot of money, concentrating the wealth, and how that ties into nobility. I often thought of nobility as somebody who's independently wealthy. They don't need to work. They live off their investments, and they can do whatever they want. They have the money to do so. The life of French court, parties, balls, powdered wigs, string quartets, Mozart, all that sort of stuff. But the part that I didn't know about was the economy of selling and buying titles, which the bourgeois class and the nobility class were tightly controlled by, or tightly integrated with. Many public offices, actually most public offices, were entirely purchasable, so it wasn't a job you applied for and got. It wasn't a job you were awarded. It was a job that you purchased. And many of these titles also came with elevation to nobility status. In the 1500s, the kings of France started selling temporarily public offices to the rising merchant classes as a way to raise emergency funds for the court. By the 1600s, this had become a firmly part of the French economy. The holders of these titles could, on payment of an annual fee, pass on that title to their heirs, or they could resell them to other third parties. So this would make purchasing a public office a commodity like grain, like land, like spices, like sugar. It's something that you could purchase, you could invest in, you could buy a title, and then you can resell it later on at a profit. And the French crown made most public offices purchasable positions. The entire judicial system of France, from the highest presidents of the parliament to the humblest functionary in some obscure rural jurisdiction, could purchase their job for the right price. And under Louis XVI, there was more than 70,000 public offices that could be bought or sold at a total annual income of roughly 900 million livres to the French crown. So almost $1 billion annually to the French crown was just on the fees paid around these titles for public offices. Maximilien Robespierre, if you're at all familiar with the French Revolution, you know that name. Maximilien Robespierre is a fifth-generation beneficiary of this system where his family was purchasing the public office title and passing it on to their heirs. Some 4,000 of these 70,000 public offices, that's roughly 5% if you're wondering, also came with elevation to the status of nobility. Nobility had a pile of legal rights attached to it. You could get away with a lot more, do a lot more. It also enabled access to parts of the military, officer positions, and it got you closer to the court of Louis. And that also came with a lot of other benefits attached to it. So nobility was something that could be purchased for the richest of the bourgeoisie. So 5% of these public offices conferred the title of nobility. It also came with a hefty price tag, though, of being forced to live a noble. To live nobly came with a lot of legal rights and privileges that being a bourgeoisie didn't have, but it also meant you had to live without exercising any profession. You had to live off the proceeds and interests from your businesses and investments. Many of these noble offices that you could purchase also came with the caveat that you had to have a minimum of 2 successive generations to hold the title in order to gain the legal noble status that was inheritable. So that meant, since you had to pay this fee for holding this job annually, that's a lot of regular income coming into the crown for this type of thing. So there's a market amongst the bourgeoisie and the noble class. Bourgeoisie could elevate themselves to nobility. Roughly 2 per day was the rate that was happening by the time of Louis XVI. So every day there were 2 brand new nobles in the French court life. And you could, if you wanted to make some money, sell a title. And because this is like a commodity, you could have somebody purchase several titles as a kind of speculation and hold them until somebody paid the price you wanted for them. And that person could, in turn, flip that job title and charge more for it and make more money. So people are treating this both as an investment to make money and also as a way to gain a cushy position, because if you have this public job, you could make an annual income from that. So there's a lot of advantages to wealthy people being able to purchase positions. And of course, the ones that confer nobility and the ones that pay the most annual salary are the priciest positions to buy. So undoubtedly, someone with this much wealth would be able to leapfrog the less wealthy bourgeoisie, and that less wealthy but no less capable lower and middle class bourgeoisie was undoubtedly annoyed and enraged to no end that they could live a hard-working professional life, but to see the better life that they would aspire to, maybe an officer position in the army or some of these other higher paying public offices, would be forever out of their reach, because they couldn't buy it. To pour more gas on this fire to the bourgeoisie rage, in 1781, there was a legal ordinance declared that decreed that anybody who wanted to be an officer in the army required at minimum 4 generations of nobility. So this was seen as creating basically an artificial barrier that would prevent the professional classes from being able to get a better life, and to insulate and protect the nobility from any sort of additional crowding from the bourgeoisie that's starting to fill the officer classes and the nobility ranks. The cost of leading a noble life was high, especially if you were in that ultra-elite inner circle of Louis's court. In order to be part of Louis's court, you had to have and be able to prove nobility going back, I think, to the 1400s. So a bourgeois person could never in their life ever expect to be presented to Louis and be part of their court. Only those with the longest standing nobility line of heredity could be in that inner circle. But of course, it's pricey to live at court. You have to maintain not only your home estates, but an estate in Paris. And then there's the cost of living. You have to always maintain the latest fashions, throwing parties, all that lifestyle. So the cost of being noble would paradoxically lead to many of the bourgeoisie being more wealthy than the nobility that they aspired to be. The government system in place by Louis XVI, and that's not really just on Louis XVI, all the kings of France before him from like the 1500s on built the system that Louis inherited. Only the most wealthy of them are able to hold and purchase all those 70,000 public offices. So that means that not just the highest echelons of government are owned by the rich. All levels of government are owned by the rich. So every possible decision maker, every possible person who could have legal influence and decision on anything from the economy and war at large down to the lowest decision maker in some rural town in Auvergne, all of them bought their jobs. So that meant that nowhere in France was competence rewarded over wealth. This is a plutocracy at every level of government. And Tobias Smollett of Scotland, he had something funny or interesting, insightful, I guess, to say about French nobility. In 1763, Tobias wrote the following, quoting Tobias, of the nobility: "They are vain, proud, poor, and slothful. They allow their country houses to go to decay, and their gardens and fields to waste, and reside in dark holes in the upper town, without light, air, or convenience. There they starve within doors, that they may have the wherewithal to purchase fine cloths and appear dressed once a day. They have no education, no taste for reading, no housewifery, nor indeed any earthly occupation, but that of dressing their hair and adorning their bodies. They hate walking, and would never go abroad if they were not stimulated by the vanity of being seen. They pretend to be jealous of their rank, and will entertain no correspondence with merchants, whom they term plebeians." End quote. A damning quote from another member of the British population, of course, British versus France, so take that with a grain of salt. But I don't think anybody here would be surprised to hear that somebody who was rich and noble would hide away and put on airs to maintain their rank, and they would turn their noses up at anybody else that they thought was beneath them. I don't think that that's a stretch to believe exists, because that exact thing exists today between many rich, poor, and middle-class people. So this is the status of French nobility and the middle class. Let's talk for just a little bit about the status of the clergy, because that's another important part of our tale. So we've talked quite a bit about the lowest class of French population. We've talked about the state of the food. Then we've talked about the middle class, the bourgeoisie class, and we talked about the professional class, the lowest end of that to the highest end, the upper rich of the rich. We've talked about the nobility. We haven't talked about the clergy yet, and that is another important player in our story that we're going to tell. So I think it's important we should understand that as well, because there is, of course, a play happening across Europe in general, but particularly keen within France, and that is the push and pull between the church, and when I say the church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the crown, the French crown. And then there is also the push and pull between the Protestants and the Roman Catholics, specifically within France, on top of that. Just a few years prior to our French Revolution, I think about 20 years, maybe 15 years, the French king abolished the Jesuit order within France, and all the Jesuits, so that would be monasteries, churches, schools, were all abolished and removed from France. And those were taken over either by professional institutions, they were sold outright, or they were handed back over to the church or kept by the crown. Wealthy land is wealthy land. The Jesuits were an extremely influential order within the Roman Catholic Church and across Europe in general, and they held an outsized influence on the educated middle class and nobility, and even the lower classes, because of course they're handing out, they're preaching in all the communities and such like that, but they're also educating. They're running a lot of the schools and colleges that the youth are being sent to. So a loss of this resulted in a loss of a standardized education system that actually had been in place by the Jesuit order, and instead, as all of these Jesuit schools and colleges were sold off to either local other institutions and things like that, the education system that was standardized became haphazard. The education you would get in one area wouldn't be the same that you would get in another. So there's that push and pull had happened just in the last generation. So the professionals and everybody else who's coming up are that first generation that are coming up lacking the standardized Jesuit education that had been part of the previous generation. And then we have the push and pull between the Roman Catholic Church in general and the crown. Now remember, the higher, most important positions, so that's the heads of the greater monasteries and the heads of all the bishoprics in France, are all positions handed out by the crown. They're concentrated in the hands of 14 noble families. So that noble family, those families have an outsized influence on all their parishes that they control. And then the push and pull between the Protestants and the Catholics as well. So if you were a Protestant, you had no legal rights in France, and there was a lot of shocking French persecution of Protestants because it is a very Roman Catholic place. But that has slowly, over the last few years, since the expulsion of the Jesuit missionaries and some kind of changes in French attitudes, the Enlightenment way of thinking is starting to come across. And although there is still a lot of violence occasionally directed at Protestants, and it is still illegal to be a Protestant in much of France, it's a thing that's kind of, I know you're a Protestant, but as long as I don't see it, I don't care what you do. It's that kind of thing that's happening. So some people could be getting this push and pull between Protestant faith and Roman Catholic faith. And of course, if you're a Protestant, you're looking at the Catholic bishops and seeing people like Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, who will become a major figure in our later series. Talleyrand was part of the French nobility, and being in the Catholic Church in France was a moneymaker. The Catholic Church was equally up for grabs as well as the rest of the government positions. As much as six-figure annual salaries were able to be made if you were the head of a bishopric or one of the greater monasteries within France. Ever since 1516, King Francis I of France, he made a deal with the Pope, and that enabled all the kings of France to have the right to appoint all bishops and abbots within France. Abbots are the heads of monasteries, if you're wondering. So just like the government positions, the heads of the major monasteries and the heads of the bishoprics within France were all positions that were up for sale. And it was so bad that in 1789, all Roman Catholic leadership positions in France, except for one, belonged to somebody of noble birth. Often, the youngest son of the family was the person who was pushed by the family to go into the Catholic Church. And a quarter of all of the Roman Catholic leadership positions were held by just 13 French noble families. And often these people would be appointed to the position quite young and then put on an accelerated program of advancement. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, who, as I said, will become a major figure, he was part of a major French nobility family, and normally you would go to the military officer career, but he had a deformity in one of his legs, and that prevented him from taking the military pass. Instead, at the age of 21, he was made a subdeacon. Within a few weeks, he was promoted to the head of the Reims Greater Monastery. And 4 years after he was appointed the head of the monastery, he would finally become an ordained priest. So imagine somebody who has no experience made a subdeacon and then within a few weeks promoted to the head of the actual monastery. Not even an ordained priest yet. So those give you an idea of some of the corruption that's happening. And by the age of 34, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, and I'm going to call him Talleyrand, he will be raised to the status of Bishop of Autun. Remember that name, Talleyrand, because that will become, like Robespierre, a major figure in our later story. So here we've set the stage. I hope we've painted a picture of the current state of France as we're into the 1780s, going into the 1790s. That helps you understand the tinderbox that is France in this era. We've spent time today talking about the life of the French peasants, how hard it was for them economically, how they could barely make any food to survive. If you were outside the greater Paris Basin region, it was very, very difficult aside from a few outliers. How getting a surplus of crop from one era, a region of France, was economically punished to take it to another region of France that could have benefited from it. So that would push the price of bread to, out of the reach of the peasant, so 3/4 of the population. That peasant class itself is spending up to 50% of their income on just enough food to be able to survive. And if you had more than 2 children in an era where there is no birth control, you could expect to not be able to afford to live at all, and you would be barely living if you had 2 children. And despite this, the population of France is still growing, and the poor classes are moving around France desperate for work. And the cities themselves, many of the poor are clamoring into the cities looking for work. And how it is common in this era, when the price of bread gets too high, for there to be riots, for people to expect there to be price controls put on bread to keep it at an affordable level for the people who can barely afford to live. Then we've talked about the middle class, the bourgeoisie class, how there is a lower end of that middle class of professionals who can purchase their jobs, but are held from getting further up because they don't have the money to get to the better positions, and how those better positions are held by a few people who are the ultra wealthy of the bourgeoisie. How all the entire government positions within France has been made over the last 200 years to be things that you can buy. How there's an economy around the purchasing and selling of these titles. Then we've talked about how precarious French agriculture was itself, how, poor harvests are happening, there's no fertilizer, there's poor agricultural practices to rest fields and, that sort of thing. And then how all the leadership is not built on competent people, but rather wealthy people who can buy it. And then the clergy itself, the Roman Catholic clergy specifically, is itself leadership that's in purchased positions. So there's an incredible coinciding of events, things coming together. This is to build the tinderbox that will become the French Revolution. And we will start next episode with the early phases of the French Revolution and the collapse of the French monarchy as we move along in our journey through an incredibly important period of time. And I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know this episode was a little dry, but I don't think there was a way to talk about the French Revolution and understand it without getting out this detail. And I hope by now, if you're a follower of the show, you love the show because it goes into these details, the nitty-gritty details, where we pick out things that another history podcast might glaze over or maybe not even mention, in favor of kind of compressing down something. But I want to go into this effort. We're going to do it right. So it's going to take as long as it takes, and I promise you the rest of this series is going to be a lot more fascinating and interesting, but still the understanding of French life, especially the way that every position from, clergy to judge or notary, everything, every public office within France was something that could be bought and sold, and there was a market around it. That was a mind-blowing revelation for me. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I will catch you next month. Thank you again. Bye-bye.